I never thought a single message could make my entire marriage feel like it had quietly cracked in half. It happened on a Tuesday evening, one of those completely ordinary nights that blur together after years of routine. Megan and I had finished dinner not long before. She had made pasta, something simple because she said she was tired from work. We ate while half watching a crime show neither of us really cared about. Everything felt normal. At least, that's what I believed at the time. After dinner, she told me she was going upstairs to take a shower. I stayed in the kitchen to rinse the plates and stack them in the dishwasher. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the water running from the sink. Her phone was lying on the kitchen counter near the edge of the table. Megan had always been the type of person whose phone buzzed constantly. Messages from coworkers, group chats with friends, social media notifications. Usually I didn't even notice them anymore. But that night something caught my eye. The screen lit up. Just for a moment. The message preview appeared and then began fading like they always do. At first I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name. Brian. I froze for a second. Brian was someone Megan mentioned often over the past few months. A guy from her department. According to her, he was the office clown, the type who joked too much during meetings and always tried to make everyone laugh. I had never met him personally, but I knew the name well enough. Before the screen went dark, I caught part of the message. Same spot after work tomorrow? I frowned slightly. For a moment I told myself it meant nothing. People from work made plans all the time. But the phone lit up again. Another message from the same contact. This time I saw more of it. Brian. Parking lot like last time? My hand stopped in the sink. Water kept running over the plate I was holding, but I barely noticed it. Something about the message felt wrong. Not necessarily proof of anything, just wrong. I told myself to ignore it. Put the plate in the dishwasher and forget about it. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, got the better of me. I reached over and picked up the phone. The screen unlocked with Megan's face recognition disabled, which meant the notification list was visible. And suddenly the message thread opened. There were more messages above. Not dozens. Just enough to make my stomach tighten. Brian. Yesterday was fun. A reply from Megan sat just beneath it. You're crazy. Someone could have seen us. I stared at the words. My brain tried to process them in 100 different ways at once. Maybe they were joking about something. Maybe they had gone somewhere with coworkers. Maybe, but the next message from Brian made those explanations feel thinner. Relax. Your husband trusts you. For a second I felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. My heart started beating faster. I stood there in the kitchen holding my wife's phone, staring at a conversation that suddenly didn't feel like harmless workplace chatter. Upstairs the shower turned off. The sound snapped me out of the trance. For a moment I considered putting the phone down and pretending I had never seen anything. Maybe that would be easier. Maybe that would keep the world from shifting under my feet. But another part of me refused. If there was an explanation, I wanted to hear it. So I stayed where I was. A minute later Megan walked into the kitchen wearing sweatpants and one of my old college t-shirts. Her hair was still damp, and she was rubbing it with a towel. She looked completely normal, comfortable, relaxed, like someone who had absolutely nothing to hide. Then she noticed me standing there with her phone in my hand, and everything changed. "What's up?" she asked casually. I held up the screen. "Hey," I said slowly. "What's this?" She stopped walking. For a split second something flashed across her face. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't surprise. It looked a lot more like panic. But it vanished so quickly that if I had blinked I might have missed it. Megan sighed dramatically. "Oh my God. Daniel," she said, walking over and taking the phone from my hand. "It's a stupid joke." "A joke?" I asked. "Yeah." She tossed the phone back on the counter like it was completely meaningless. "Brian's an idiot. He sends dumb messages like that all the time." I looked at the screen again. "Same spot after work? Parking lot like last time?" I said. She crossed her arms immediately. The expression on her face changed. And suddenly it felt like I had just accused her of something ridiculous. "Wow," she said slowly. You're seriously doing this? Doing what? Acting jealous over a stupid work message. I'm not jealous, I replied. I'm asking what it means. She shook her head and let out a short laugh. You know what your problem is? She said. What? You don't trust me. The accusation landed so quickly that it almost stunned me. That's not what I said. No, but it's exactly what you're implying. She leaned against the counter and stared at me. You see one dumb message and suddenly you're interrogating me like I'm cheating on you. I blinked. That hadn't even been the word in my mind until she said it. Cheating. I'm not interrogating you, I said carefully. Then what are you doing? I just want to know what the messages mean. She rolled her eyes. It was a joke about eating in the car after work, she said. Last week the cafeteria closed early and a few of us grabbed food and sat in the parking lot. Brian thought it was hilarious. Her tone made it sound painfully obvious, like I was the only person in the world stupid enough not to understand it. You're reading way too much into it, she added. She grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water. Then she looked at me with the same expression someone might use with a paranoid stranger. Seriously, Daniel, she said. You need to relax. For a moment I didn't know what to say, because somehow the entire situation had flipped upside down. I was the one holding the phone. I was the one asking questions. But suddenly I felt like I was the one who had done something wrong. Yeah, I said quietly. Maybe. She took a sip of water and walked past me toward the living room. A minute later the TV came on again. The house returned to normal, at least on the surface. But that night, lying in bed next to Megan while she slept peacefully beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about those messages. I replayed the conversation in my head again and again. The wording, her reaction, the way she turned the situation around so quickly. And one thought kept circling in my mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe it really was nothing. But the longer I stared at the dark ceiling above our bed, the more one sentence echoed in my head. Same spot after work tomorrow. Parking lot like last time. And no matter how many explanations I tried to come up with, it didn't feel like a joke. Not even close. For the next few days I tried to convince myself Megan was right. That the message meant nothing. That I had overreacted. But the human brain has an annoying habit when doubt appears. Once the seed is planted, it starts digging through memories, searching for anything that might support it. And suddenly, things I hadn't thought about before started coming back. Small things. At least they had seemed small at the time. For example, Megan had started staying late at work more often. At first it happened once every couple of weeks. Then it became almost routine. 2 or 3 nights a week, she would text me around 6 in the evening saying something like, "Big deadline today. Might be home late." Or, "Meeting ran long. Don't wait for dinner." I never questioned it. Her job in marketing could be unpredictable. Deadlines happened. Campaign launches happened. I always figured that was just part of her career. But now, lying awake at night, I started realizing something strange. She never talked much about those late nights. If I asked how work went, she would give short answers. Busy. Same as usual. Nothing interesting. At the time I assumed she was just tired. Now I wasn't so sure. Another thing that came back to me was her laptop. Megan used to leave it open on the kitchen table all the time. Sometimes she would even ask me to look at presentations or proofread emails before she sent them. But sometime in the past few months that changed. Now whenever I walked into the room while she was working, the screen would close almost instantly. At first I thought it was just habit. Then I noticed it happened every single time. Click. Laptop closed. "Just work stuff," she would say casually. And I never pushed. Because why would I? She was my wife. Trust was supposed to be automatic in a marriage. But the memory that bothered me the most happened about 3 weeks before the message. It was during a corporate dinner Megan had invited me to. Normally I avoided those things. Rooms full of people talking about marketing strategies and quarterly numbers were not exactly my favorite way to spend an evening. But Megan insisted. "It'll be fun," she said. "Everyone keeps asking to meet you." So I went. The restaurant was one of those modern places downtown with dim lighting and overpriced food. Most of the people at the table worked with Megan. That was the first time I met Brian. He was exactly the kind of person I had imagined from Megan's descriptions. Tall, confident, the type of guy who seemed completely comfortable being the center of attention. At first, everything felt normal. People talked about work, joked about office drama, complained about deadlines. Then, at some point, the conversation shifted. Brian leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a smirk. "So you're Daniel," he said. "Yeah." He nodded slowly, like he was studying me. "I've heard a lot about you." I smiled politely. "Hopefully good things." The table laughed lightly. Brian raised his glass. "Well," he said, "Megan definitely married a calm guy." Something about the way he said it made a few people at the table chuckle. I wasn't sure why. "What does that mean?" I asked. He shrugged. "I mean, look at you," he said casually. "You seem like the type who just lets life happen." Couple more people laughed. The comment wasn't openly hostile, but it carried that subtle edge some people use when they want to insult you without technically saying anything wrong. I glanced at Megan. She laughed too. Not loudly, but enough. Brian leaned forward slightly. "Honestly," he continued, "you're a lucky guy." "Why's that?" He gestured toward Megan. "Because she's way more interesting than you." The table burst into louder laughter. Someone muttered something about Brian always being brutal. Another person clinked glasses. I forced a small smile. I didn't react. Not because the comment didn't bother me, but because making a scene at my wife's work dinner would only make things worse. So I let it go. At least that's what I thought at the time. Now, weeks later, that moment looked completely different. Because when I replayed it in my mind, something else stood out. Brian didn't look embarrassed when he said it. He looked comfortable, confident, like someone who knew there would be no consequences. And Megan, she hadn't defended me. She hadn't even tried. She just laughed. Back then I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that Brian was just being sarcastic. But now, after seeing those messages on her phone, that memory started to feel less like a joke, and more like a glimpse into something I hadn't understood yet. One night, for days after the message, I was sitting alone in the living room while Megan was upstairs getting ready for bed. The house was quiet. My mind was racing again. That's when I opened our shared banking app on my phone. I didn't open it because I expected to find anything. At least that's what I told myself. But once the screen loaded, I started scrolling through the recent transactions. Groceries, gas, utilities, normal things. Then something caught my attention. A restaurant charge. From a place downtown. It was expensive. Much more expensive than the kind of casual dinners Megan usually had after work. I checked the date. 3 weeks ago. The same night Megan told me she had stayed late at the office. My chest tightened slightly. Maybe it had been a work dinner. That would make sense. But when I opened the transaction details, something didn't line up. It had only been a table for two. And the bill was large. Large enough to suggest wine, dessert, time. I stared at the screen for a long time. And slowly, for the first time since seeing that message, a terrible possibility started forming in my mind. What if the message hadn't been a joke? What if the parking lot wasn't about eating takeout after work? What if it meant something else entirely? I locked my phone and leaned back on the couch. Upstairs, Megan was laughing softly while watching videos on her phone. Completely relaxed. Completely normal. But now I couldn't stop thinking about Brian's words at that dinner. "You're a lucky guy. She's way more interesting than you." At the time, it sounded like arrogance. Now it sounded like something else. Something much worse. Because suddenly I had a feeling Brian knew something that I didn't. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I might be the only person who didn't know what was really going on. After noticing the restaurant charge, I tried to convince myself there was still some reasonable explanation. Maybe it really had been a work dinner. Maybe someone from the office had used Megan's card and reimbursed her later. Maybe the whole thing was still just a coincidence stacked on top of another coincidence. But the problem with suspicion is that once it settles in your mind, It starts connecting things you never noticed before. And suddenly those connections become harder to ignore. The next evening Megan came home later than usual again. She walked through the door looking tired, kicked off her shoes near the hallway, and dropped her purse on the chair like she always did. "Long day," she said with a sigh. I was sitting on the couch pretending to watch TV. "Yeah," I asked. "Deadlines," she replied. "You know how it is." She walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and poured herself a glass of water. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it quickly. Then she flipped it over so the screen faced down. It was such a small movement, so natural. But this time I noticed it. And suddenly I realized she had been doing that constantly. Every time her phone lit up. Every time a message arrived. Face down. Out of view. Like someone protecting something. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I quietly got out of bed and walked into the living room. The house was dark and silent. I opened the banking app again. The restaurant charge was still there. But this time I kept scrolling. And that's when something else appeared. Parking charge. Near a hotel downtown. The timestamp matched the same night as the restaurant bill. My stomach tightened. I tapped the map location. The address appeared instantly. It was a parking structure attached to a boutique hotel. The kind of place people used when they wanted privacy. For a long moment I just stared at the screen. Because suddenly the timeline became impossible to ignore. Dinner. Parking. Hotel. All on the same night. Megan said she was stuck at work. The room felt colder. But what made everything worse was something I noticed the next morning. Megan left early for the office. She kissed me on the cheek before walking out the door. "Don't work too hard today," she said casually. The moment the door closed behind her, I walked into the kitchen. Her laptop was still on the table. That alone was unusual. She almost never left it behind anymore. I hesitated for a moment. Part of me knew this was crossing a line. But another part of me also knew something important. If I didn't look now, I might never get another chance. So I opened the laptop. It woke instantly. Her messaging app was still open. I didn't need to search long. Brian's name appeared near the top. My hand tightened on the edge of the table as I clicked the conversation. At first the messages looked normal. Work jokes, meeting complaints, random memes. Then I scrolled further, and the tone changed. "Brian, last night was worth the risk." "Megan, you're insane." "Brian, you didn't seem to think so." A few messages later, another line appeared. "Brian, does your husband suspect anything?" Megan replied almost immediately. "Daniel? Please, he's way too trusting." I felt something cold settle in my chest. But it didn't stop there. Brian sent another message. The look on his face at that dinner still cracks me up. Megan responded with a laughing emoji. Then she wrote something that made my hands shake. "You were brutal." But honestly, he didn't even notice. For a long moment I couldn't breathe, because suddenly everything clicked. The dinner, the jokes, the message on her phone, the restaurant, the hotel parking. All of it fit together in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. They had been meeting for months, behind my back, and apparently they found the whole situation funny. I slowly closed the laptop. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. At first I expected anger to take over, or rage, or some uncontrollable reaction. But strangely enough, none of that happened. Instead something else settled in. Something much colder. Clarity. Because if they thought I was too trusting to notice, then they clearly underestimated me. That evening when Megan came home, everything looked normal. We talked about work. We ate dinner. She told me about some presentation she was preparing. I nodded at the right moments. I asked a few questions. I even laughed once or twice. And she never suspected anything had changed. But inside my mind something had already shifted. Because instead of reacting emotionally, I started thinking logically. If I confronted her now, she would deny everything. She would delete the messages. She would destroy the evidence. and somehow I would end up looking like the jealous husband she had already described to Brian. No, that wouldn't happen. If the truth was going to come out, it would happen on my terms. Quietly, carefully. Over the next few days I began gathering everything I could. Bank statements, **TS, dates, locations. I even drove past the hotel parking lot one evening after work, just to see it for myself. Each small piece added to the picture, and the more evidence I collected, the clearer the timeline became. The affair hadn't started recently. It had been going on for months, maybe longer, but the most surprising part wasn't the betrayal. It was the way I felt while uncovering it. Because instead of breaking me, it gave me something else, patience. And for the first time since reading that message on Megan's phone, I realized something important. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight. All I needed to do was wait for the right moment. And when that moment finally came, everyone in the room would know exactly what had been happening, including Brian, and including Megan. Once I saw the messages between Megan and Brian, something inside me changed. Not dramatically, not in the way people imagine when betrayal happens. There was no yelling, no smashed plates, no dramatic confrontation in the middle of the living room. Instead, everything became very quiet, almost calm, because once the truth was clear, emotions became less useful than patience. Over the next few weeks, I started living two separate lives. The first one was the version Megan saw every day. In that version, nothing had changed. We still had dinner together most nights. We still talked about work, about the news, about random things couples normally talk about after years of marriage. Sometimes we even watched movies together on the couch like we always had. I smiled when it was appropriate. I nodded during conversations. I asked normal questions, and Megan never suspected anything. The second life was the one she didn't know about. That life happened quietly behind the scenes. Every few days I checked the shared bank account and saved copies of suspicious transactions. The restaurant charges became a pattern. Small dinners here and there, almost always on nights Megan claimed she was working late. Sometimes the payments were small. Sometimes they weren't. But they always followed the same rhythm. Dinner, parking, occasionally a charge near the same hotel downtown. I saved **TS of everything. Then there were the messages. Megan became slightly more careful with her phone after the night I questioned her about Brian's text. She locked it more often and kept it closer to her when she was at home. But she still made mistakes. Sometimes she left the laptop open when she went to shower. Sometimes she stepped out to take a phone call and forgot to log out of her messaging app. Every time that happened, I quietly copied what I saw. I never took the laptop out of the house. I never forwarded anything. I simply photographed the screen with my own phone. Short conversations, inside jokes, plans. One message from Brian stood out more than the others. "Same hotel next week?" Megan's reply came a few seconds later. "Only if my husband is working late again." He responded with a laughing emoji. Then he wrote, "Poor guy. Still clueless?" Megan replied, "Completely." That was the moment I stopped feeling any doubt. Whatever respect had existed between us was gone. But strangely enough, the anger I expected never fully arrived. Instead, I felt something colder, distance, like I was watching the collapse of someone else's marriage instead of my own. By the end of the third week, the folder on my laptop contained everything I needed. Bank statements, photographs of message threads, dates, locations, a clear timeline. And once I had that complete picture, I stopped searching. Because I already knew the truth. The affair had been going on for at least 5 months. Possibly longer. Then something unexpected happened. One Thursday evening, Megan walked into the living room while I was reading and sat down beside me. "You're coming with me next Friday," she said. I looked up. "To what?" "Another corporate dinner." I raised an eyebrow. "You know I hate those." She smiled slightly. "I know, but this one's important. The whole department will be there." I closed the book slowly. "Why is it so important?" She shrugged. "Some new partnerships, company announcements, networking. You know, normal stuff. Then she added something that caught my attention. And Brian keeps asking why you never come anymore. For a brief second, I wondered if she was testing me. But her expression looked perfectly casual. Like the name meant nothing. I nodded slowly. All right, I said. She smiled. Good. It'll be fun. I didn't answer, because inside my head a completely different thought had just formed. If Brian was going to be there, then the timing might actually be perfect. The following week passed quietly. I didn't gather any more evidence. I didn't check the messages again. Instead, I focused on something else. Preparation. Friday evening arrived quickly. The restaurant Megan chose was larger than the one from the previous corporate dinner. A private room had been reserved in the back for the entire group. When we arrived, several people from her office were already seated around a long table. A few recognized me from the earlier dinner and greeted me politely. Megan introduced me again to a couple of coworkers whose names I didn't remember. Then Brian walked in. He noticed us immediately. Daniel, he said loudly, spreading his arms as if greeting an old friend. I stood up from my chair. Brian. He shook my hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. Man, it's been a while, he said. Yeah. He glanced at Megan briefly, then back at me. Glad you finally decided to join us again. I had some free time tonight. Well, he said with a grin. This should be entertaining. Dinner started normally. People ordered drinks. The conversation flowed around the table. Work stories, office gossip, plans for upcoming projects. At first, Brian behaved exactly the way he had during the previous dinner. Confident, loud, always ready with a joke. Then about halfway through the evening, the attention shifted toward me again. One of Megan's coworkers asked what I did for a living. I explained briefly. Brian leaned back in his chair and smirked. You know what I like about Daniel? He said suddenly. The table grew quiet. What? Someone asked. Brian raised his glass slightly. He's the kind of guy who has no idea what's going on around him. A few people laughed. Just like before. Brian shook his head with a smile. Seriously, he added, the world could fall apart and he'd still think everything was perfectly fine. The laughter grew louder. Across the table, Megan smiled awkwardly. But she didn't say anything. And that was the moment I realized something important. Everyone here thought this was harmless teasing. They thought it was just office humor. None of them knew what Brian and Megan had really been doing. None of them knew what I had in the folder sitting quietly inside my jacket. I reached down slowly and placed the folder on the table. The laughter faded almost instantly. Brian looked at it, confused. What's that? He asked. I opened the folder calmly. And for the first time that evening, the room became completely silent. The folder landed on the table with a soft sound. It wasn't loud. But in the middle of a crowded restaurant, surrounded by a table full of people who had been laughing only seconds earlier, it felt like something much heavier had just been placed between us. Brian looked down at it, then back at me. What's that supposed to be? He asked with a smirk. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the folder slowly. Inside were neatly organized papers and printed **TS, bank statements, parking receipts, copies of conversations. Evidence I had spent weeks collecting while everyone else believed I was completely unaware. Across the table, a few people leaned forward slightly, curious. The laughter from earlier had already faded. Brian leaned back in his chair again, still smiling, though I noticed the smile had become a little tighter. You bringing paperwork to dinner now? He joked. I slid the first document across the table. It stopped directly in front of him. Brian glanced down. At first, he didn't seem to understand what he was looking at. Then he read the header. It was a bank statement, but not from my account. It was a printed copy of a corporate expense record. One that clearly showed several charges made with a company card, restaurant bills, parking fees, and several payments connected to the same hotel downtown. Brian's smile disappeared. He looked up at me again. What is this? He said. Before he could say anything else, I placed another sheet on the table. This one contained **TS of message conversations. Brian's messages. Megan's replies. The words were clearly visible to anyone sitting close enough to read them. Same hotel next week? Only if my husband is working late again. Someone at the far end of the table stopped laughing entirely. Another coworker leaned closer to see the messages. The room that had been full of conversation just minutes earlier became strangely quiet. Megan was staring at the table now. Her face had turned pale. "Daniel," she said quietly, but I didn't look at her. Instead, I calmly placed another document on the table. This one showed the company card details again. Highlighted. Dates. Locations. Amounts. Everything lined up perfectly with the nights Megan had supposedly been working late. One of the managers sitting near the center of the table picked up the paper and looked at it carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. "Brian," he said slowly. Brian pushed his chair back slightly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You can't just..." I placed the final page on the table. It was a photo I had taken of Megan's laptop screen. The message thread was clearly visible. Brian's message sat right in the middle of the page. "Poor guy. Still clueless?" Megan's reply was directly beneath it. "Completely." No one laughed this time. The silence around the table felt heavy. Brian's confidence finally cracked. He looked around the room, realizing everyone was now staring at the documents. "Those messages are out of context," he said quickly. But the manager at the table didn't look convinced. He flipped through the pages again. "You used the company card for these dinners?" he asked. Brian hesitated. "That's not what this is about," Brian said defensively. But the manager pointed at the highlighted transactions. "These charges were filed as business meetings." Brian didn't respond. Across the table, Megan still hadn't moved. She looked like someone who had just realized the ground beneath her had disappeared. Another person at the table spoke quietly. "These dates match our budget reports." Someone else muttered, "That's company money." Brian looked at me again. The arrogance from earlier in the evening was gone now. "You set this up," he said. I shook my head calmly. "No," I replied. "You did." The manager stood up slowly from his chair. "We're going to need to review this," he said. Brian looked around the room again, but no one was laughing anymore. No one was supporting him. The atmosphere had completely changed. The dinner that had started as a relaxed corporate gathering had turned into something very different. Megan finally spoke again. "Daniel, please." Her voice was barely audible. I looked at her for the first time that evening. Weeks earlier, I had imagined this moment many different ways. Anger, arguments, shouting. But standing there now, I felt none of that. Just clarity. "I'm done," I said quietly. Then I closed the folder. No one tried to stop me as I stood up from the table. The room remained silent while I walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear people beginning to talk again in hushed voices. Managers discussing the documents. Coworkers whispering to each other. Brian trying to explain something. But I didn't turn around. By the end of the following week, the company had completed its internal review. Brian was fired for misuse of corporate funds. Several of the charges had been falsely labeled as business expenses. Apparently, the company didn't appreciate paying for someone's secret relationship. As for Megan, our marriage didn't survive much longer after that night. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to fix. The truth had already been placed on the table in front of everyone. And the same room where people once laughed at me had become the place where the laughter stopped. Completely. In the days after that dinner, everything moved quickly. The company launched an internal investigation, and the evidence spoke louder than any explanation Brian tried to give. Misused corporate funds were easy to verify. Within a week, he was gone from the company. Megan and I barely spoke during that time. The silence between us was heavier than any argument could have been. Eventually, the divorce papers were filed. There was no dramatic ending, just the quiet realization that our marriage had already ended long before that night. Months later, I sometimes thought about that dinner, not with anger, but with a strange sense of closure. The humiliation I once felt had been replaced by something calmer: clarity. The moment everyone stopped laughing had changed everything. I rebuilt my routine slowly, focusing on work and reconnecting with friends I had neglected for years. Looking back, the betrayal hurt, but it also forced me to move forward. And in the end, that quiet decision to stay calm had spoken louder than any revenge ever could.